Have you ever noticed that so often it's not our enemies who wound us the deepest, but the very people who share our last name? There's a silent kind of pain that no amount of money can cover up. The pain of betrayal inside your own family. I lived it firsthand when I discovered that my own daughter had erased me from a family portrait, as if my presence were nothing but an inconvenience to be deleted. But here's the paradox. Sometimes the deepest humiliation opens the door to the most powerful lie. Revenge. And I don't mean revenge that destroys, but the kind that restores respect and dignity. Because no matter how hard someone tries to erase a father, there isn't a photograph in the world that can wipe out the story he wrote. The strange part is that the very next day after trying to erase me, that same daughter showed up at my door, crying and begging for help. That's when I realized life has a peculiar way of flipping the script. When you least expect it, the one who rejected you ends up being the one who needs you most. And you? Have you ever thought about what you'd do if someone in your own family humiliated you? Would you stay stuck in the pain, or would you turn that pain into strength? I never imagined a simple portrait could hold so much hidden emotion. When I walked into my daughter Madison's living room and saw that family picture hanging on the wall, my heart stopped for a moment. There was a blank space where my face used to be. No one had to explain anything. The betrayal was right there in front of me, silent but brutal. An incomplete portrait might look like a detail to others, but to a father it's a sentence. You don't belong anymore. What hurt wasn't just the absence of my image, it was the coldness with which it was done. No explanation, no note, no conversation, just emptiness. And if there's one thing I've learned about humiliation, it's that it cuts deepest when it comes wrapped in indifference. When someone you raised, loved, and protected your entire life acts as if you're invisible. The wound doesn't stay on the skin. It sinks straight into your soul. I had already faced harsh criticism as a literature professor, been questioned in public, endured the disapproving looks of colleagues who didn't believe in my teaching methods. But nothing compares to the pain of seeing your own daughter deny you the respect that should come naturally. Dignity within family should never be negotiable, especially after so many years spent instilling values, not just in my students, but in her. Maybe you felt this too, being physically present, yet realizing someone's heart has already erased you. It's like being at a party and noticing every eye avoids yours, as if you don't belong there. That's the cruelest betrayal, the kind that doesn't need words, just actions. And a portrait without your face is an action that screams. I stood in front of that frame for minutes, trying to collect my thoughts. I remembered the times when little Madison would run into my arms with her notebook drawings scribbled in crayon. How many times had she said, "Dad, you're my hero"? That's the contradiction of life. The same heart that once made you proud can one day become the same heart that wounds you with humiliation. And there's no manual on how to deal with that. In that moment, I thought about how families so often hide pain behind smiles. Outsiders only see the pretty picture on the wall. But if you look closer, you notice the empty spaces, the holes no one admits exist. I saw myself in that blank space, as if I were a stranger inside my own family. And that's where the silent revenge is born. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that watches, waits, and acts at the right moment. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't slam the door. I didn't question Madison right then. I simply took a deep breath and stored that image in my memory. Why? Because I've learned that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from not reacting immediately. Silence can be the first move toward a deeper answer. It's like chess. You don't move the fastest piece, but the most strategic one. And in the game of life, every move matters. What many don't understand is that erasing someone from a photo doesn't erase history. The picture can be cropped, the face cut out, but the blood in the veins, the lessons taught, the education passed on, all of that remains. It's like trying to pull out the root of a tree that's already spread deep underground. You can cut the trunk, but the root survives. I was that root, and Madison would eventually see it. As I stared at that empty space, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just pain, it was a spark, a strange mix of sadness and serenity. Because I realized this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something greater. Maybe life was showing me, through that humiliation, that dignity isn't lost when someone tries to erase it. Dignity is only lost when you decide to give it up yourself. So that day, I left her living room in silence, but with a firm decision in my heart. I wouldn't lower myself to petty revenge, but I also wouldn't accept being treated as disposable. Respect can be denied for a while, but sooner or later, the truth always comes back to the surface. And deep down, I knew that empty portrait was only the first chapter of a story far from over. Some pains can be hidden inside a house, but others get exposed in front of everyone. That's what happened to me a few days later, when I went to, attend Madison's company launch. I wasn't formally invited, but I didn't need to be. I'm her father, and fathers don't need invitations to celebrate their children's achievements. I put on my best suit, adjusted my tie, and walked in, trying to leave behind the bitter memory of that portrait. Deep down, I still hoped it had all been some kind of misunderstanding. The event was grand. Spotlights, a red carpet, waiters carrying champagne glasses. In the entrance hall stood a huge mural displaying the family's history as a symbol of tradition and values. But one glance was enough to shatter my hope. In every photo, my image had been digitally erased. This wasn't just absence, it was planned exclusion, and that kind of public humiliation in front of friends, acquaintances, even former colleagues, burned more than any insult ever could. People whispered. I could hear it, even in hushed tones. That's her father? Why isn't he in the photos? The sting of betrayal isn't just in the act itself, but in the silent judgment it plants in others. It's as if everyone begins to believe the manipulated version of the story. As a literature professor, I'd always taught my students, whoever controls the narrative controls the memory. And in that moment, my daughter had chosen to erase me from the narrative of her own family. I stood frozen in front of that mural, holding my breath the way you hold back a tear to keep it from falling. And in that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes you have to swallow your pride in order to preserve your dignity. I could have shouted, called Madison out right there, exposed the pettiness of her gesture. But what good would it have done? I would have looked like a bitter, resentful man. So I chose silence. And silence, my friend, can be a powerful shield against humiliation. It doesn't solve the problem, but it keeps the wound from becoming a public spectacle. While the speeches carried on, I remembered a phrase I used to repeat to my students. Education is the only wealth no one can ever steal from you. In that instant, I finally understood the depth of those words. Madison could try to erase me from the photos, but she could never erase the years I spent teaching her how to write, how to think, how to dream. The respect I had for myself was far greater than the shame she was trying to impose on me. And that kind of inner freedom is what keeps us from sinking when everything around us seems to collapse. Have you noticed how, in certain gatherings or social settings, some people go out of their way to belittle others in public? It's common, but devastating. I've seen businessmen ridiculed at conferences for daring to share a different idea. I've seen mothers dismissed at school meetings simply because they didn't have the same financial status as the rest. Here's the truth. Public humiliation only works if you agree to play the victim. The moment you refuse to wear that mask, the shame transforms into strength. That very night, after leaving the event, I returned to my office. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of loneliness but also a strange clarity. I opened the closet and pulled out a box of old memories. Inside were letters, notes, and keepsakes Madison had given me throughout her childhood. They reminded me that behind the woman who now denied me respect was still the little girl who once believed in me. Deep down, I knew those memories might be more valuable than any mural, perhaps even more valuable than her entire company. As I dug deeper into those memories, I found something that would change everything. Buried among yellowed notebooks and faded photographs was a sealed folder I had never shown anyone. It felt as if life itself had saved it for this very moment, whispering, "George, it's not time for revenge. It's time to wait." Because true revenge doesn't come with shouting, but with the right revelation at the right time. When I got home that night, after being erased in front of so many curious eyes, I decided not to turn on any lights. I wanted silence. I just wanted to hear the sound of my own footsteps on the old wooden floor, as if the creaking of the boards was more honest than anything spoken at that glamorous inauguration. The humiliation I had endured still weighed heavy, but instead of drowning in it, I chose to open the box I kept hidden in my office. That box was my private treasure. Not because it contained gold or jewels, but because it held fragments of what I considered most precious. Memories. Between books with handwritten dedications, worn-out notebooks, and faded photographs, I found the little notes Madison had written as a child. Small folded papers, sometimes scribbled in crayon, other times with bright pens. One of them read, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a writer, just like you." I read those words the way one reads a prayer. The emotion ran through me, not only as nostalgia, but as living proof that I had once planted seeds of education and dreams in that girl. Before the betrayal, there had been admiration. It's strange how memory works. Sometimes a forgotten piece of paper is enough to project an entire film in your mind. I remembered those nights at the kitchen table, stacks of books around us, while I explained metaphors and symbols to Madison. She listened with wide, shining eyes, scribbling down each word as if they were secrets. And yet, that same daughter had now erased me from her story. That contradiction is what makes family ties so fragile. Love and pain coexisting side by side, like pages of the same book. As I read those notes, I realized something bigger was unfolding. Life, in its mysterious way, was reminding me that no one can erase the truth completely. A photo can be cropped, a mural can be edited, but memory is untouchable. More than that, the dignity we cultivate over the years doesn't disappear with a humiliating gesture. It might be muffled for a while, but sooner or later, it rises again. Maybe that was my silent revenge, not against Madison, but against the lie they were trying to build. At the very bottom of the box, tucked between envelopes and birthday cards, I found that sealed folder. I remembered clearly. I had promised myself never to open it without reason. It was as if it had been waiting for its appointed time, the day when it would finally matter. And that night, after being excluded, not just from a photo, but from the entire narrative of my family, I felt the moment had come. I held that folder in both hands, the way one holds fate itself. I didn't open it, not yet. I just looked at it. My heart told me that inside was something powerful, something that could change not only my life, but Madison's as well. It's an interesting thought. Sometimes we carry keys that can either set people free or lock them in, depending on how we choose to use them. In my hands, I held the chance to transform betrayal into redemption, but I also knew every revelation has its time, just like fruit only ripens when it's ready. So I closed the box, but left the folder on the table, not as a reminder of instant revenge, but as a symbol that truth cannot be buried forever. I knew sooner or later that folder would speak for me, louder than any argument. And maybe that was the hidden lesson in all this. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. Dignity cannot be begged for, it must be lived. And revenge, when it is truly needed, doesn't require violence. It requires revelation. I sat in my armchair, staring at the folder, the soft glow of the lamp outlining its edges. It was as if it whispered, "Wait, the right moment will come." And deep down, I knew it would, because life has a curious way of collecting debts. I just never imagined the reckoning would come so soon, and that it would arrive not through me, but through someone pounding desperately at my door. In life, it isn't always the loudest cry that echoes the deepest. More often, it's the silence that speaks for us. After that night of rediscovering Madison's notes and memories, I decided not to seek confrontation right away. I could have called her, demanded explanations, thrown those reminders of her childhood admiration in her face, but what would that have accomplished? At best, another argument, another layer of humiliation. Instead, I understood that silence, when used with wisdom, can be the most elegant form of revenge. Not the kind that wounds, but the kind that exposes. I spent the whole night reflecting on it. Dignity cannot be begged for, and respect cannot be forced. They blossom when you show, through actions, that the truth is stronger than any manipulation. That's why, the next morning, I wrote a short note and left it at her door. A portrait can be erased, but the truth always comes back. When you need me, I'll know. They weren't words of bitterness, but of warning. A reminder that the education I gave her couldn't be undone, and that family roots, even when cut at the surface, remain alive underground. Many people believe silence equals weakness. I used to think that way when I was younger. Once, as a teacher, I was attacked by a colleague with a cruel criticism in front of my students. My instinct was to answer back, to defend my methods, to raise my voice. The result? The students remembered the argument more than the lesson. Years later, I realized that if I had just looked at him in silence, I might have said far more. Silence unsettles people because it forces them to face their own reflection. That was the lesson I tried to apply with Madison. I didn't need to humiliate her. I didn't need to shove documents or memories in her face. All I had to do was remind her that I was still here, steady, waiting. The note wasn't a threat, it was a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous for those who live on appearances, because sooner or later they reveal the truth. As I tucked the note into her doorframe, I took a deep breath. I felt like I had found a way to transform betrayal into inner freedom. I was no longer a hostage to humiliation. I had freed myself from the burden of having to prove my worth. It's like carrying an object for years without realizing how heavy it was, then suddenly letting it go. The body feels light. The pain lingers, but it no longer controls you. That's what happens when you understand that dignity is a personal decision, not an external approval. Maybe you've lived something like this too. How many times, in family relationships or even at work, do we feel the urge to fire back instantly, to shoot back the arrow of injustice? But if we look closer, we'll see that some of life's greatest lessons were never delivered in words, but in silence. Like when a father doesn't respond to an insult, but stands tall, or when a mother overlooks temporary ingratitude and keeps caring anyway. That's not weakness, it's strategy. It's the strength of someone who knows that time reveals what haste hides. I went back home and sat in my old leather chair. The note was no longer with me. It was with her, and somehow that brought me peace. It was like handing over a key that could open a door, or not. The choice was hers. It was no longer my role to beg for recognition. I had done my part. Now, silence would work in my favor, like an invisible ally. That night, I fell asleep earlier than usual, but my rest was cut short by something unexpected. Sharp, frantic knocks echoed on my door, as if the world itself had decided to wake me. I got up, still dazed, and realized that perhaps silence had already done its work, because when pain comes knocking, it doesn't ask permission. And that night, standing before me, wasn't the proud, distant daughter I'd seen at the inauguration. It was Madison, in tears. I woke to the sound of desperate pounding at my door. Not the polite kind, the kind you hear from a guest. These were urgent, almost panicked, as if someone were racing against time. I opened the door, my eyes still heavy with sleep, and there she was, not the elegant, polished, confident woman from the photos of her company launch. Before me was simply my daughter, face soaked with tears, voice trembling, unable to hold up the mask she'd been wearing. She walked in without waiting for an invitation, stumbling over her words. She said Jonathan, her husband, had made reckless investments. The new company, the very one launched with so much glamour and speeches about tradition and values, was on the verge of collapse. Suppliers were demanding payment, contracts had been mishandled, and whispers in the business world had already begun. Their family name was being tied to impending bankruptcy. The humiliation she feared most was closing in, not on me, but on her. As she spoke, Madison sobbed uncontrollably. Each tear, each word, carried a weight I knew well, the weight of betrayal against oneself. Because deep down, she knew she hadn't just erased me from photos. She had erased me from her decisions. She had chosen to put all her trust in Jonathan while treating me like an outdated man, a father who didn't fit her polished image. And yet now, in chaos, it was me she turned to. That's the thing about family. When the ground crumbles beneath you, it's not the business world or the fair-weather friends who offer a hand. It's blood. I listened in silence. My heart swung between opposites, compassion and pain, respect and resentment, memory and hurt. Seeing my daughter on her knees begging for help was shocking. The same daughter who erased me from the mural was now weeping at my door, and there was nothing staged about her tears. They were raw, the tears of a child who knows she's lost her way. In that moment, I realized life has a peculiar way of delivering justice, without us having to lift a finger. True revenge isn't born from hatred, but from silent justice. I remembered a lesson I often taught in class. A person's character isn't revealed in success, it's revealed in failure. And Madison, in that moment, was stripped bare before me, without masks. For the first time in years, I didn't see the businesswoman or Jonathan's wife. I saw the daughter I had raised, the same girl who once left me little notes saying she wanted to be a writer, the same one who used to beg me to read her bedtime stories, and that memory made me hesitate. How could I deny help to the same little girl who once held my hand so tightly? Here's something important to understand. Respect within a family must be built like a house, brick by brick, gesture by gesture. When the foundation crumbles, the whole structure falls. Madison had shattered that foundation with her choices, but now she was living through the collapse of the sandcastle she built with Jonathan. In her eyes, I could see the painful freedom of someone finally acknowledging her mistakes. She didn't need to say it. Her condition already said it all. She knelt on the rug in my living room, gripped my hands tightly and repeated, "Dad, please help me. I don't know what to do." The weight of the moment was overwhelming. I could have seized it to throw her humiliation back in her face. I could have said, "Now it's too late. Now you'll taste the same poison you gave me." That would have been the obvious revenge. But there's a difference between revenge and justice. One wounds, the other teaches. And as her father, I knew it wasn't enough to hurt her. I wanted her to learn. That's why I stayed silent for a few moments. My only response was to glance at the folder I had left on the table the day before. She noticed. Her eyes followed mine, and in that second, she understood that something was there. She didn't know what, but she felt it. Her tears dried for a moment, replaced by desperate curiosity, because when despair tightens its grip, any clue to a solution becomes hope. I moved closer to the folder, placed my hand on it, and said only, "The way out. You're looking for might be in here, but before I open it, there's something you need to understand." She stared at me with red, desperate eyes. For the first time in years, Madison was truly ready to listen, and I knew the night still held revelations heavier than any blank check. I held the folder the way one holds a secret kept for years. Madison's gaze clung to it, as if that object held the key to pulling her back from the edge. I knew what was inside could change her future, but I also knew it wasn't just about numbers or contracts. It was about memory, identity, dignity. It was about showing my daughter that even when she tried to erase me, there was something of me alive in every line of her own story. I opened the folder slowly, letting silence fill the room. Inside were documents I had safeguarded for decades, contracts and publishing rights for a book I had written many years ago. At the time, I'd released it almost casually, never imagining it would one day matter. But recently, an international publisher had purchased the rights for a new edition, translated into several languages. The money involved was more than enough to save Madison from ruin. While she wiped her tears, I placed the papers on the table and said, "The solution you're looking for might be here." Her eyes widened, first in surprise, then in disbelief. She stammered, "Dad, I didn't know that book had been sold. I didn't even know you still wrote." And in that moment, I realized the depth of the betrayal I had suffered. It wasn't just the public humiliation of being cut from portraits, but the indifference that had made her forget who I really was. A professor, yes. A father, yes. But also a writer. A man who had never abandoned his calling. Someone who didn't need photographs to prove his worth. Life loves irony. While Jonathan gambled money on reckless investments, my daughter ignored the fact that her own father had quietly built something solid through education, steady work, and the dignity of never giving up. That folder was more than a stack of contracts. It was proof that the most powerful revenge isn't the one that humiliates, but the one that reveals. And revealing to Madison that I was still a pillar, even when she treated me as a burden, struck deeper than any speech ever could. She looked at me as if she were seeing another person entirely, and I smiled, not with pride, but with compassion. I told her, "You erased me from the pictures, Madison, but you can't erase what I've built. This book was born from sleepless nights, from pages written between classes, from stories drawn out of the life we lived together. When you were a girl and said you wanted to be a writer, remember? This is where I planted that seed, and it's that very seed that now has the power to save your company." Her tears returned, but they were different this time. Not just desperation, emotion. She touched the papers as if they were sacred. For the first time in years, I saw my daughter fall into silence, not out of disdain, but because she had no words left in the face of revelation. And that silence was the greatest sign of freedom I had seen in her. She, who always had sharp answers, was speechless, and I, who had so often been dismissed as outdated, was now her only way out. At that moment, I thought about how family relationships are like books. Some chapters fill us with pride, others with pain. Some pages are torn, some lines poorly written, but there are also paragraphs that last forever. What Madison had done to me was betrayal, yes, but what life was doing to her now was a kind of narrative correction. It was as if the story itself demanded coherence. You don't erase a father the way you erase a sentence. Madison looked at me with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Dad, I don't deserve this. Not after what I did." I interrupted her, not harshly but firmly. "This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what you learn. Money might save your company, but what can really save you is understanding that respect isn't negotiable, dignity can't be erased, and family can't be cropped out of pictures." She lowered her head, as if finally grasping that the real humiliation wasn't the one she had tried to inflict on me, but the one she now felt before her own conscience. And there, in that small office, in the silence of the night, I realized something I would never forget. The truest revenge doesn't come when you humiliate someone back, but when you Show that, despite the pain, you're still standing. The folder on the table wasn't just a chance to save a business. It was a chance to save a bond. It was a reminder that dignity survives time, betrayal, and absence. And deep down, I knew that revelation was only the prelude to a question I had to ask. A question heavier than any signed check. I placed my hand over the documents and looked Madison in the eye. Inside me, feelings tangled into something hard to define. Part of me still burned from the humiliation of being erased from portraits and murals. Part of me wanted only to embrace my daughter and end her suffering. But life had taught me that there is no true freedom without confrontation, and avoiding the right questions only delays the inevitable answers. So I asked, calmly but firmly, "Why am I unworthy of your family's portrait but worthy enough to save your life?" The silence that followed was suffocating. She couldn't look me in the eye at first. She stared at the floor, as if searching for courage in the threads of the rug. Her lips trembled, but no words came. I knew that question carried the weight of a silent revenge, not one that destroys, but one that forces the other to face their betrayal. My voice hadn't been bitter, it had been just, because the respect she had denied me needed to be confronted, not with shouting, but with truth. After several seconds, which felt like minutes, Madison broke down. The tears came again, now mixed with confession. "Jonathan convinced me. He kept saying you were outdated, that your image didn't fit with the company's polished brand. And I believed him. I thought I had to erase the past to build the future." She choked on the words, each one like a heavy stone pulled from her chest. It didn't surprise me. I had suspected Jonathan had planted those ideas, but hearing it from her was different. It was like a stab that paradoxically also brought relief, because at last, I knew I wasn't crazy. I confessed that hearing her words was like reliving every humiliation all over again. I remembered the night I saw the portrait with that empty space. I remembered the mural, the whispers of the guests. Each memory was like salt rubbed into an open wound. But at the same time, there was a strange kind of freedom in finally hearing the truth, because nothing hurts more than silent betrayal, the kind that's never explained. And now I had, at last, an explanation. Cruel, yes, but real. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Madison, you can erase me from photographs, but you cannot erase me from your story. You carry my blood, my teaching, my memory. To erase me is to erase yourself," she sobbed, unable to respond. And in that instant, I understood something essential. Sometimes, the humiliation we endure is the very path life uses to teach the people we love. The emotion I saw in my daughter's eyes was not just pain. It was the recognition that she had committed an injustice. I could have used that moment to crush her, to return every tear with cutting words. I could have said, "I warned you. Now deal with it." That would have been the easy revenge, but I chose the harder one, not demanding money, not shallow apologies, but real change. Because in the end, that's what matters in family. Not just fixing mistakes, but rebuilding bridges. Money might save the company, but only respect could save the family. So I did something unexpected. I took her hands and said, "I don't want your tears. I want your respect. I want your reconciliation. I want you to recognize me, not because I hold contracts that can save you, but because I am your father, and I've always been here. The dignity you stripped from me in public must be restored in public, not to feed my ego, but so you understand that family cannot be erased." She nodded through her sobs, as though accepting a just sentence. In that moment, I realized the confrontation had done its work. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. I hadn't needed to threaten. Just one question was enough to dismantle the lie. The silent revenge was complete. Madison now understood it was never about image, or status, or business. It was about truth, respect, and dignity. And deep down, as I watched her weep before me, I realized this might be the beginning of her liberation, and mine as well. But inside me, a new question rose. Yes, I was willing to help her, but under what conditions? I knew that if I gave in without requiring anything, the entire effort would be wasted. Dignity must be rebuilt with solid bricks, and the next step was making clear what those bricks were. The decision was not just about saving a company, it was about saving the memory of what we once were and what we could still be. That night, after the confrontation had finally brought the truth to light, I took a deep breath before giving Madison any final answer. I knew I held the key to saving her business, but I also knew such an opportunity couldn't be wasted on numbers alone. What was at stake wasn't just money, it was respect. dignity, the chance to rebuild a family that had been torn apart like that empty portrait. Life was offering me a rare choice, to turn my pain into revenge or into freedom. Madison was still crying in front of me, waiting for my decision. I looked at her and felt the weight of decades of raising her. I remembered the nights I read her bedtime stories, the mornings I drove her to school, the times I held her bike steady until she could pedal on her own. None of that could fit into a check. None of it could be bought. So I spoke slowly, firmly, choosing each word the way you choose bricks to build a house. I will help you, Madison, but not without conditions. Because more than saving your company, I want to save our family. She lifted her eyes, confused. Conditions? She asked, as if she were used to solving problems only with money. I smiled faintly. Yes, conditions. Because this isn't just about numbers. It's about values. Then, one by one, I laid the cards on the table. The first condition, respect. She would have to acknowledge me not just in private, but in public. No more erased photos, no more awkward silences. I demanded to be treated with the dignity I deserved. The second condition, reconciliation. I wouldn't accept a staged relationship where she hugged me in public only for convenience. I wanted the real bond rebuilt, the one that broke when she chose to believe I was a burden. That meant time. Together, real conversations, genuine presence. It meant remembering that family isn't a business card, but a shared story. The third condition, public recognition. I didn't want applause or grand tributes. I wanted her to acknowledge, in front of others, that she owed me respect. Because the humiliation I suffered wasn't private, it was public. I was erased before friends, colleagues, and strangers. It was only fair that the restoration also be public. You erased me from the portraits in front of everyone. I want you to return my dignity in front of everyone. Madison stayed silent, absorbing each word. In her eyes, I saw the fear of Jonathan's reaction. She whispered, "And what if he doesn't accept it? He already calls me weak whenever I think differently." There it was, the root of the problem. She had traded the upbringing I gave her for the manipulation of a man obsessed with status. I squeezed her hands and said, "Daughter, true weakness is living enslaved to someone else's opinion. Respect is not negotiated, it's demanded. If Jonathan doesn't accept that, the problem isn't yours, it's his." I reminded her of something I had always taught in class. Dignity is the only inheritance you cannot pass down. It must be earned. Houses, companies, cars, bank accounts, none of it matters if you can't look at yourself in the mirror without shame. True freedom comes when you decide you will no longer live for appearances. Madison looked at me with tearful eyes and, for the first time, didn't argue. She simply nodded in silence. As I spoke, I felt a paradox stirring inside me. Yes, I wanted revenge. I wanted her to feel the pain she had made me feel. But I realized the true revenge wasn't in denying help. It was in setting conditions that forced her to relearn the value of respect. Because humiliation isn't erased with money, it's erased with change. And if she accepted my terms, it would be her first step toward transformation. The night dragged on, and exhaustion began to settle in. But something inside me was fully awake. I knew this quiet decision would be remembered for a long time. Not for the sum of money I offered, but for the conditions I set. And in that moment, I understood the strength of a father who doesn't shout, but stands firm. Revenge wasn't in refusal, but in demand, and freedom wasn't in forgetting her, but in making her remember. Before leaving, Madison held my hand and said, "I'll keep every one of these conditions, Dad, not because you demanded them, but because I finally understand there is no future without respect. I was wrong, and I'll make it right." Her words were simple, yet full of emotion, and I knew she meant them. That was the beginning of reconciliation. Not perfect, not immediate, but real. When I closed the door behind her, I went back to my chair and took a deep breath. There were no fireworks, no triumphant sense of victory. What I felt was peace. The peace of knowing I hadn't surrendered to humiliation, but I also hadn't let myself be consumed by anger. The peace of understanding that respect isn't asked for, it's demanded, and that dignity, even when trampled on, can be reborn stronger. I also knew this quiet decision would still be tested, because reconciliation, no matter how sincere, always faces trials, and the greatest one was still to come, when the truth had to be shown before everyone. The day of the company's new event arrived faster than I expected. It was an important conference, filled with clients, investors, and family friends. I could have refused to attend, as a form of silent revenge. After all, I still carried the marks of the last humiliation, but something inside me said I had to be there, not just as a father, but as a symbol. Because when betrayal happens in public, restoration also has to happen in public. I wore the same suit I had worn at the last event. Not because I lacked choices, but because it was intentional. I wanted to prove to myself that it hadn't been. The suit that was rejected, but my presence. The fabric that once carried shame would now carry dignity. When I arrived, I noticed the curious stares. Many still remembered my absence from the murals and whispered again, "Do you think he'll be here this time?" But I didn't let it shake me. I walked firmly, like a man who no longer has anything to prove, because respect had already been won in silence. When I entered the main hall, my eyes immediately went to the photo mural. I expected to see the same empty space where my image had once been erased. But to my surprise, not only was I back in the pictures, my photo had been placed at the very center, not tucked into a corner, not as an afterthought, but right in the middle, as a pillar. It was a shock, not only to me but to everyone present. It was impossible to miss. Emotions surged through me like a silent lightning bolt, bringing a sense of liberation that words could never capture. People murmured again, but this time in a different tone. No whispers of doubt, only murmurs of respect. Some even approached me, shaking my hand warmly, and I realized, when dignity is restored, it doesn't just lift the one who regains it, it teaches everyone watching. Madison had fulfilled the first condition I demanded, public respect, and she did it not timidly but boldly, making sure everyone could see I wasn't a burden to hide, but a root to be honored. During her speech, Madison took the stage and for the first time spoke about me openly. Her voice trembled, but every word carried weight. "I want to thank my father, George, who taught me that true education cannot be erased and that dignity cannot be bought. Without him, none of this would exist." Each phrase was like another brick rebuilt in the wall she had once torn down. The emotion was palpable. I saw people rising to their feet, applauding, some even with tears, because it's rare to witness someone admit to such a deep mistake in public. I confess that in that moment, my heart filled with a mixture of revenge and forgiveness. Revenge, because the humiliation I had endured was now turned into respect before everyone. Forgiveness, because I saw that my daughter was truly trying to rebuild the bridge she had broken. That is the power of family, the ability to bleed, but also to heal. The respect I had demanded was now being given back to me twofold, not out of obligation, but sincerity. As the applause filled the hall, I realized how symbolic the scene was. I had been erased from portraits and murals, yet here I was now at the very center of them. It was as if life itself whispered, "You tried to be invisible, but you can't hide the one who carries the foundation." And that's the lesson I carry with me. No matter how many times people try to erase you, if you live with dignity, sooner or later, you will be seen. Of course, Jonathan couldn't hide his discomfort. I caught his cold stare across the room, struggling to mask his displeasure. He knew this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was his personal defeat. His attempt to turn me into a shadow had failed, and I, silently, smiled inside. This was the revenge I wanted, not one that humiliates, but one that reveals. Despite all his money and influence, he couldn't erase the root I represented. After the speech, several guests came up to me, praising Madison's courage, but deep down, I knew it wasn't only her courage, it was the fulfillment of the condition I had set, and more than that, it was the beginning of a real reconciliation. The portrait restored, my image at the center of the mural, my words echoed through her voice, all of it proof that the education I planted had never been in vain. And yet, I still held on to one final card, something I hadn't revealed to Madison, or to anyone, because even though my dignity had been restored, I knew there was something greater I needed to do. A final gesture, one that could transform not just the mural or the speeches, but leave in everyone's memory a lesson they would never forget. I had already decided, that very night, I would show them all that portraits aren't just pictures on a wall. Portraits can be alive, full of color and truth, and I was ready to present mine. That evening, when everyone seemed satisfied with Madison's speech and with my image restored on the mural, I knew something was still missing. Yes, I had regained my place in the photos, but photos are only paper and pixels. The real portrait of a family isn't frozen poses, but what lives in the heart. It was time to show that to everyone. I stood and asked for a few minutes on stage. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the same tension I had felt at the last event. But this time there was anticipation, not disdain. Calmly, I thanked everyone for being there, and explained that I had commissioned a special work of art. I asked for a large canvas to be brought forward, covered by a white cloth. when the cloth was pulled away, silence filled the room. It was a painting created by one of my former students, now a recognized artist. The portrait showed the whole family together, not in luxurious clothes or artificial poses, but gathered around a bookshelf, the symbol of the education that had always been my legacy. In the center of the painting, I was portrayed as the pillar, not out of vanity, but because that's what fatherhood truly is, holding everything together without erasing anyone. The emotion was immediate. I saw tear-filled eyes. I heard gasps of surprise. Madison covered her face with her hands and wept in front of everyone. They weren't tears of despair, like the ones she had shed in my home, but tears of recognition. There, before friends, investors, and even Jonathan, she stood up, ran to me, and embraced me. With a trembling voice, she said, "Dad, I will never again try to erase a story that only exists because you wrote it first." Those words echoed like music inside me. They were living proof that freedom had finally arrived. As she hugged me, I thought about the irony of life. The same daughter who once wounded me with betrayal and exposed me to public humiliation was now restoring my respect and dignity in front of everyone. And it wasn't just about personal pride. It was about something greater, a lesson for all who were watching. Many in that room had probably erased someone from their own portraits, a father, a mother, a grandparent, someone dismissed as outdated, and now they saw clearly the price of such a choice. Jonathan, however, remained still. His gaze was cold, but empty. He knew he had lost not only the narrative, but also the control he once had over Madison. The most powerful revenge wasn't against him directly, but against his manipulation. He tried to turn me into a shadow, and I returned as light. I didn't need to attack him with words. It was enough to exist, enough to stand firm, so that truth spoke louder than any excuse. By the end of the night, many guests came to me praising not only the painting, but also the message behind it. They said the portrait was different because it seemed to breathe life. I simply smiled. I knew the real triumph wasn't in the figures of a contract that would save the company, but in reclaiming what had always been non-negotiable: family. The canvas wasn't just paint, it was the symbol of a new page, written not with vanity, but with emotion, respect, and reconciliation. I returned home that night with a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Revenge had been fulfilled, but not in the sense of crushing or humiliating. It was fulfilled in the noblest way, restoring dignity, freeing my daughter's conscience, and proving that no matter how hard someone tries to erase a father, he always lives on in the roots of the family. The living portrait was there for everyone to see, but also within us. And in that embrace, I realized that some stories don't end with a period. They end with ellipses, because there is still more to be written. The story you've just heard isn't only about a portrait. It's about what truly sustains a family: respect, dignity, and reconciliation. How many times in your own life have you felt erased, diminished, or treated as if you had no value? And more importantly, how many times have you ignored the very people who were always by your side? Stop and think. Isn't it time to restore those bonds before it's too late? Isn't it time to turn humiliation into growth, betrayal into lessons, and revenge into freedom? Because in the end, it's not the photos that tell our story. It's the choices we make, the gestures we live. And now I ask you, if today you had the chance to give back respect to someone you once hurt, would you have the courage to do it? Or would you keep repeating the same mistakes that once wounded you? If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story is not just entertainment. It's an invitation to rethink your family relationships and reclaim what truly matters.